Would you mind talking a little bit about parkour and how you got into it and what exactly it is?
Oh, yes, of course. I love talking about parkour. Don't talk about it so much these days. But anyway, so first for me, parkour was a way of social liberation from the prescribed ways of behavior and movement and thought. Um, Liberation on all fronts, if you like, through the body, uh, through the vehicle of the body. I think it's very tangible, very clear. How about you stop moving in the conventional pedestrian fashion and just go however you like, with whatever speed you like, over the walls, fences, jumping off things, climbing on things. Why not? I think it was a period of my life when I was frustrated and entrapped with many things within life, study, traditional martial arts, karate. So many prescribed ways, do this that way, not the other way, think this way, not the other way. Everyone tells you what to do and how to do things, but what about the genuine discovery of how things are for yourself? How about expressing yourself? What about that inspiring quote by Bruce Lee? Martial arts are about fully expressing yourselves, not about the ways to learn a fixed kata, and which of course takes place too, but it goes beyond it. There is more to it. So I had the body, lots of energy, the mind, which yearned for freedom. So there you go, parkour, a very inspiring way to express yourself. Uh, I think lots of people around the world those days have discovered parkour for similar reasons and started practicing it. Plus, it carried across a very wholesome ethos of being strong in order to be useful, because it came from the firefighters training regimen, and before that from the method of training military, and before that through George Hebert, French Marine, who has developed the natural method of physical education. It was a way to, yeah, develop vigor, not only physical, but also emotional upliftedness and, self-discipline, self-leadership. I think the story how George Hebert came across this method was quite inspiring. He was taking part in the evacuation of the island of Martinica when the eruption of volcano occurred there, and he helped many people to leave the island. And he acknowledged that it was due to his physical capability and qualities of self-leadership that he could accomplish it. Then he came back, rewinded, and how did they develop those? Well, he traveled, he observed the indigenous people in Africa as part of his journeys as a marine, and saw how they move, how they run and climb and swim, they use their bodies in a natural way. Nobody particularly tells them a technique or a method. It's just an efficient, sensible way to move, interacting with the environment. So he then picked it up, trained himself, and then after that incident with the volcano eruption, he uh, classified it into a method, which became known as the natural method, la méthode naturelle. You probably can say it better in French than me. And it started to be used in France quite widely in the beginning of 19th century, used by the Marines, by the military, and in the civil physical education as well. This is how eventually it was appropriated by the firefighters training. And yeah, from there, boys from the street have appropriated it, and one of those boys was David Bell, whose father was a renowned French firefighter, Raymond Bell, who was trained according to natural method and was a national hero. And so his son took on this legacy, and along with a group of other people, started to train on the streets to just develop themselves using the natural environment of the city. Walls, rails, buildings, to jump, to climb, to vault, to run, to land, etc. To overcome obstacles. How can you use the body to get from point A to point B using these capabilities that you have at hand, so that you can perhaps help somebody. Somebody is stuck in the fire in the apartment somewhere, how you can climb the wall and save them or whatever. How it can be applicable in the real life situation. In the process, they discovered that it not only builds the body, but also build good morale, good sense of ethics, and sense of purpose. So not only the self-expressivity was there, not only liberation, but also, you know, ethical and moral virtue was developed. So obviously for me that ethos was agreeable, very much so. So I started doing it. I didn't really have anybody to teach me how to do it. I just went out on the streets and trained. Would run through the streets at random, would just pick a random route and go find some things along the way, rails, walls, abandoned buildings, train there. No need for fixed environment. Just use the things at hand. Express yourself first, develop certain skills and bulletproof the body. Second, have this virtuous mindset of training the body for the sake of higher purpose, not just for the sake of monkeying around, which parkour has become for some, but there is much more potential there than that. Yeah, it certainly helped me to find many friends wherever I went in the world. I would meet parkour communities and we would train together and develop ourselves. And yeah, that in short, how I came across it and how I trained.
You said that parkour originally came from these, it was this technique of skillfully saving people in these like situations. And then you also mentioned that you came across it at a time when you were quite angry and you were going through other things mentally and maybe physically and emotionally at the time. Did you really start training as an outlet to develop this ethical, virtuous path? Or was it more of a combination of developing your body and doing something cool?
Um, yeah, I guess there was always a combination for me. Like you can't take away, if you are a human being, one part and say that was only about this part. I guess maybe some people can. I don't think so. Like human being is a totality in some way. And even if you don't focus upon certain motivations, they're still there. And I was still continuing, even when I was doing parkour, to train in martial arts. And martial arts also carry across this ethos of morality and self-discipline. And actually, at the core of it, altruism. How do you develop strengths to be of service, of help to others? How do you develop the personal fortitude to be helpful? So, yeah, it was there for me, this parkour as well. I guess it traveled from martial arts into parkour. And actually, the founders of parkour were carrying across this ethos very much so. Many of them were also martial artists as well.
How did you yourself, I mean, you mentioned a lot about the background of parkour, but how did you get into it yourself? What drew your interest? And you said that you just trained by yourself. So how did you know what to do?
Well, you have internet, you have media, you see people do stuff, you watch a couple of films with the founders of parkour acting in those films, like District 13 was a very famous one, Yamakasi was another famous one. And it featured this type of movement, which was, yeah, of course, cool. And it also displayed ethical, virtuous behavior, like uh, characters in those films were engaged in the acts of helping others, saving others, being useful. Then, yeah, lots of videos came across on the web, and you can just pick it up and monkey see, monkey do kind of situation. Why are you in particularly interested about parkour today
Well,
and
for
my
me
experience of it?
today, well, you don't really talk about it very much. So I'm just curious and also particularly interested in how you see the route you're going to take. Because you're making these decisions on the fly, you're kind of bringing your body into a flow state. And I'm just interested how you've trained this sense of knowing in your body to be able to work with a dynamic environment and adapt to it on the go, but also having a line. So seeing a, do you, I mean, I don't know anything about parkour, actually, just from what you've mentioned to me in anecdotal conversation. So, yeah, so I'm very curious about how do you see a line, or when you look at a street, for example, or if you're in the bush and you see a path, or how do you see the path where you have to go?
Well, I can, of course, speak about it and tell you how, but I think you kind of know as well. You are a professional martial artist. How do you know the line of actions you take in a fight?
Well, I don't know. I just do it.
Ah, ah. So who knows? Or what knows in this case?
So there's been a lot of research into flow states and how to use flow to be more productive or to be more successful in any particular activity or to simply have more joy in your life. And researchers have identified a few flow triggers that people can use in order to get into a state of flow. And for me, I read a book by Stephen Kotler called The Art of Impossible. And he talks about these flow triggers in this book. And at the time, I was coming back from injury. So I was really, I already knew intuitively, I suppose, when I was in flow, but I wasn't so sure about how to trigger this sense, particularly because I was working a lot with self-doubt. So recently I've been watching this TV show called Ted Lasso, and there's an episode where one of the players actually something happens to him in a game, and then he's overcome with a condition that they call the yips, which is where basically they describe it as a mental state where a person can't perform very basic movements, even though they're professional athletes. They feel like they can't do even the most basic move. And this has happened to me as well in training. And I also have heard that it has happened to other people in other sports like gymnastics or diving, where something might happen, they may be injured or something can happen in competition and they're not able to, a mental block forms and you can't bridge that mental gap in order to do something that came so naturally to you before. So
Mm.
for me, I was working through injury. I had, a lot of doubt around not I mean, it wasn't like central to everything, but it was just like this voice in the back of my head. A lot of the people around me also, like they just, you have a lot of negative energy and people who say things when you're coming back from
Mm.
injury or when you're persisting in a goal that, people don't understand really what you're doing except for you. So I started to be more intent on reading about flow. I also started listening and reading to the researcher Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book on flow. He's widely published on flow. So yeah, and so it just goes through all of these triggers, which I started to try to implement in my own training, which is when I became more cognitively purposeful about using these triggers in training in order to then forget about them once I was in competition. So I guess to bring it back to parkour, and also, I mean, just to bring it back to this general flow state that we get into where we don't really know what's the next move. I'm just curious in parkour, like when you decide to go for it, what processes do you follow? I mean, do you have a process of, or some kind of ritual, or is there anything that you do to prime your mind and body for that run?
Well, thanks for sharing the research on flow. I don't particularly know any of the flow triggers or
We can go
how
through them.
it is conceptualized. I would be delighted to hear. Yes, thank you. And I think listeners too. Okay, well, for me in parkour, you see, when you have a line, the objective is very simple. You go from point A to point B. How? Well, how it arises. It's like, there is a technique of drawing very straight line. You don't look at the line. You look at the destination of where you're gonna put that line and where you end that line. So you draw and the line turns out to be straight. Same there. You don't look at what are you doing right there. You're looking at the destination where you want to get, and the rest is done on the go, on the flight, in the flow, whatever. Plus, for me, it was always very inspiring thing to do parkour because for me it was associated with freedom, and freedom is a big thing, not only physical freedom or social freedom or freedom of the mind, but also spiritual freedom, the sovereignty. So whenever I would engage with parkour, it's that inspired, uplifted state would take over. And in that state, it was very easy. Like everything can become a line, a route, anything becomes not an obstacle, becomes a stepping stone, which you interact with and play and use to uh, get from point A to point B. That's one thing. Another thing is daring aspect of parkour because certain moves or jumps or obstacles one overcomes are risky and tricky and dangerous and require overcoming certain fears within yourself.
Sorry, Evgeny, would you mind just repeating what you said about obstacles? So the obstacles are no longer obstacles. Would you just mind saying
Stepping
that?
stones.
Hmm. So obstacles are not
Mm,
obstacles. They are stepping stones on the line.
yes, yes, yes. That's how the vision changes for you. It's a bit along the Zen lines. There is this thought form, but then there is no thought form. It is the same. There is this obstacle. It perhaps is on your way, a problem in your way, but it's also an opportunity to overcome that very problem. Hence, it becomes a stepping stone. So then illusion of having things in your way starts breaking down because, well, these things, the obstacles become opportunities, becomes a way to explore something about yourself, find something out about yourself, develop some kind of degree of strength, fortitude or virtue, overcome certain fears. Uh, so the obstacles provide opportunities as such. Yeah, and challenges. And then these challenges become something like a riddle along the lines of a riddle to solve using the intelligence of this body, innovative approach of some sort, not necessarily relying on logic. Yeah. And that's where, of course, the creativity comes into the picture a big time in parkour. That's why it's an art form, just as any other art form. How does one approach this particular challenge? Yeah. And flow states come into it as well. Like I remember we used to do exercises. For example, you have this problem, like these few obstacles. How do you overcome them? Well, we would have an exercise. You have, say, 3 minutes. You flow between these obstacles. Do whatever. Uh, just don't stop. Just go. Just go, 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 go. Don't stop. You don't know what to do. You forget the technique. You just do something. Something arises from the body. Yeah, that becomes very interesting and very fruitful because that's where you discover the pathways you didn't know existed before. You discover the moves you didn't know you had. Uh, and gradually they connect into the flow. I think a big obstacle in the flow is having a preset idea in your mind as to what you are going to do, what you want to do. And that's probably why one of the reasons why these athletes and yourself included were getting into this stupor and they weren't able to perform even the most basic of movements. I think it has to do very much with the mind which got, educated with what movements or techniques need to be done within a particular sport. The parkour the same. You have a certain set of techniques for jumps or vaults or whatever. But usually in between those, people are at a loss. They don't know what to do. They can do this one or that one. But that was the purpose of this exercise of 3 minutes flow, say, of doing whatever, to bridge the gaps between known techniques and the whole multiplicity of ways of expression or ways of approaching the problems which exist there. So you're no longer in a stupor when you encounter the obstacle or a problem.
I guess yeah, I can relate to what you're saying quite a bit actually, which is really cool. I was just thinking about the part where you kind of know what your body can do though. So you, at least in karate, in kumite training, we have similar riddles or obstacles, which is the opponent throwing a particular attack. And so that would be considered as the challenge, and you have to get around that and find a way to score or find a way to counterattack or anticipate. So actually you have these prescribed movements, but then as you repeat them, maybe through this 3 minute kind of drill or 3 minute flow, you move, you kind of iterate and move away from that. There's a couple of things that I want to highlight is that one of them is the novelty aspect, which is where you have to take a risk in some situations. So you kind of know the capability or the level of your body, but to do something different, you have to try something new because you
Mm.
already know you haven't done it before. So there's that. There's like the risk-taking novelty aspect, which is a trigger for dopamine actually in the brain, according to the flow research, which is what would trigger a flow state. And
Mhm.
then there is the other aspect of letting go. So in order to take the risk, your thinking mind sort of has to take a back seat and you have to let go of doing this action with my hands because it's almost like what's forward and what's telling me that doesn't feel good or this is not comfortable. That mind, that part of the mind has to take a back seat or go get in the trunk of the car that's driving. That's my metaphor. Part of the mind has to get in the front seat. Um, so yeah, I mean, another, while I'm on it, I'm just looking at this chart here and it says that curiosity, passion, and purpose is another trigger for dopamine. So this combination of curiosity and novelty can be really powerful in that release action of the mind where you let go of this thinking, of this pre pre-formulated expectation. Yes, it is the expectation part of the mind, maybe, that sort of is subdued, and another part of the mind comes forward. This part of what, I mean, how do you think about that when I say it in those terms? Can you relate to it from your
Oh,
experience?
yes, yes, absolutely. I very much agree with that. Conscious mind has to go into the trunk, take a back seat. And I think it is a kind of a definition of flow, if I were to give one. It's that the border between the conscious mind and unconscious mind blurs temporarily. So that's what unites the flow with a trance state or light trance state. Because in the trance, it is as well happening. The border between conscious and unconscious dissolves temporarily. And the material which is there, the knowledge which is there, the whatever, repressed, is there, starts to surface and take action. So what actually flows? The flows that which is already there, the potential energy which is there, which just needs to be expressed. And by unhinging the habitual railings of the conscious mind, trained in a certain technique or whatever, this can be done. And it's a very good point that a risky, daring activity is a trigger for it, because that's where the knowing or conscious mind is at a loss. It does not have a method anymore, doesn't it?
It has no reference.
It has hit the brick wall, yeah. In parkour, it happens literally.
Mm.
So you find some other way, and something else unlocks within you, yeah, and starts to flow. And there are, of course,
What is
levels
that?
at which you can go deep into it. What is that? You? The recesses of you, which are unbridled, you know, the drive of yours, the inner force, the inner power, uh, the vitality, the vigor, the enthusiasm, they'll come out. Yeah. I think here you can even start bridging, flow states with trance states, even from back from ancient times. Like a friend of mine, Dr. Tony Yap, likes to talk about this, how trance is rooted back in those ancient mysteries of Dionysian, where they would enter the exalted states and being enthused, which is entheo, meaning with God or in God, united in some sense. Yeah. So the enthusiasm is emergence of the energy which you already have within you, your inner resource, your very aliveness, uh, your very being. So it can flow. And that's why trance rituals have been so paramount, throughout the history, throughout pretty much all of the cultures in the world, either through shamanism or through particular dance practices or through theater practices or through whatever we have these days as a cathartic events like, festivals and parties and stuff like that. People always look for ways to bridge that gap between conscious and unconscious so something else can emerge. So they can finally kind of run free and bind. I think that has always been like a leitmotif to many human endeavors and activities. How can I find a way that my inner potential can be fully expressed? And isn't it these days a big topic of various self-development coaching retreats and stuff like that? Unleash your inner power or something like that, and it all speaks to all that age-old mechanism of How do I tap into the unconscious potential, unconscious resource? And why people want it? Well, because it's enjoyable as well, isn't it? When things flow, the mechanism doesn't jam. The neurotic fixations are not there anymore. Well, it's pleasant. Mm. Things are just getting done.
I don't know where to
What do
start.
you
There was
reckon?
so much there to unpack. Yes, I think that people do seek to have this flow state. I'm just returning to this diagram that I have in front of me. Um, and it speaks to the other side of flow, that is this reduction in cognitive load, where you are completely immersed in your activity. And as you mentioned, you this bridge between the conscious and unconscious, you're acting, but you're not necessarily um, cognitive, of you're not able to articulate what you're going to do before you're going to do it, because you're so in the moment, you're so in the present moment, that it's happening instantaneously. The experience is in the instant. I'm just thinking, I have an image of a moment that happened over 10 years ago, where I felt like I was moving in slow motion. I was anticipating things that were coming towards me. I was in a fight, in a competition, and I felt adrenaline moving through my body. So I felt, this energy moving through my body, and I could see things. I could anticipate the opponent as she was moving around me. And I felt like this time dilation of being able to respond, and still things were moving in real time. I mean, it wasn't like I was in slow motion. I was moving at actually very high speed. There's a similarity, I guess, like as you were speaking, I was also thinking about the way that you're talking about the parkour line. It's almost as though it's playing out like a show, right? But I think in reality, the decisions you're making, they're in a fraction of a second. Um, and for karate as well, like we have fights, and the fights are the duration of the complete fight time is 3 minutes. So when you're in the action, we're talking about microseconds and quarters of a second. Time is so fractional, but you still feel like there is a lot of time. You still feel like you have time to move your body in a particular way, to position yourself so that you can anticipate another body moving in a certain way, and the following movement. You're reading the space actually in a very, as though time has been stretched out, which is really interesting, because you're really using another part of your mind there. You you're deeply embodied in the activity, and you have, as you said, you described it as seeing the line of where you want to go. I remember when I started learning to ride a motorbike, um, my instructor was like, "Don't look at the road directly in front of you. You look in the distance of where you want to go, otherwise you'll crash." Um, and it's like that for karate as well. If you have to do any movement where you take your eyes off your partner in order to get into a position, or if you're anticipating something, you can't look at your immediate next frame, because it's not going to be fast enough. Actually, you'll be delayed if you think like that. Or if you prepare by starting at the start of the process, actually, the preparation. For example, if I'm going to do a punch that's anticipating my partner, I'm not, if I want to do an anticipation for my partner, I'm not thinking of the full move. I'm thinking of the pre-move in order to make the explosive part of the action very fast. And then this type of thinking was also used by my strength and conditioning coach, Georges Jambor, who who was telling me that in order to be faster on the jumps or to have more explosiveness on the jumping, that I'm not thinking about pushing up. I'm thinking about the push up as I'm in the air, if that makes sense.
Yes, it very much
So,
does. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a part of the plyometric training within parkour as well, and as a bouncy disciplines like gymnastics or tricking, it's the training of, you jump off something and you quickly bounce back off the ground as soon as you land. So when you are dropping off the obstacle or a thing, you're already anticipating the next takeoff. So in the process of one move, you are already priming the next move. I think that's very much how it works in the connecting or linking the movements within parkour. This constant plyometric engagement of the body. Plyometric means you stretch the tissues and you quickly contracted them. Like a basketball bouncing on the ground, one aspect of it. But there is, of course, the explosivity of whole body is involved. So once the body drops off something, it already doesn't think how it's gonna drop and take off, and it thinks of the next move that it is taking. And I think, yeah, in the flow, like you described, these decisions of the next move happen within fractures of seconds. And then, of course, flow state is not only applicable to martial arts or movement or parkour or sports, it's applicable to anything, basically, I think key with it is that a person has knowledge of what they're doing. And even better off if they have a virtuosity in the craft they're doing. I think that makes chances of entering flow state higher because the patterns of actions are already learned. In karate, you've learned first kihon, basic techniques, then kumite, kata, you link them into sequences, then kumite, you freeform it. Even you're not freeform it straight away, you have fixed kumite. What are they called? Gihon kumite or gohon kumite? I forgot. Same in any other craft you learn, isn't it? You learn the very basic pattern of something. Then you connect it into a more complex pattern. Then you link it into some kind of story, and then you freeform with it. Only when you have those building blocks, then you can step back, let the conscious mind off the railings, so it can actually start pulling out all those patterns from the unconscious, from the subconscious, from the learned pool of knowledge that you have. Before you have it, you can enter similar state, a trance state, I suppose, but there will be nothing to link, no building blocks to link together, no one movement to lead to another movement, and no outcome to anticipate. Yeah, it will be a practice devoid of structure, like a chaotic blah, outburst of something of it's still a self-expression, but it's not a self-expression um, to write home about.
I was just curious to hear more, a little bit more about trance that you started talking about in terms of how you have used trance yourself as another modality for exploring this flow state. You started to mention a light flow, like, the spectrum of the trance states. And you also started talking, yeah, you started talking about the trance states. And I'm just wondering if your knowledge of if it's in the forefront of your mind, the idea of the karate training or parkour in terms of thinking about lines or spatial movement when you're in trance. Or could you describe a little bit of, your experience with trance?
Yeah, well, that's a good thing to reflect on the spatial movements or linear movements. What's their place in trance or any kind of movements? I suppose learned movements is the broader definition for all of them, or learned patterns of even thought or, methods. Like I said before, they create, this inner structure that you follow, or something follows it when you enter trance, or when you enter light trance, which is flow. See, okay, there is a little distinction. Light trance, kind of intermediate trance, then deep trance, then the full loss of recollection, the possession, being possessed within the activity, fully regressing kind of into unconscious. Light trance, where we just flow, is whereby you still, of course, have recollection of what is happening, where you are, etc., who you are. But the jams, the brakes on the process of your movement are switched off. You just go. Nothing jamming anymore, nor, you know, no stone or rock in the mechanisms which jam that mechanism, your whatever. Uh, Preconceived idea, your self-judgment, your internalized lack of self-worth, you name it, whatever can jam the mechanism. But once the flow state is entered, you just go. Go with the activity using the learned patterns that you have. So the deeper you go, the you start to go back even more, sit at the back seat or even in the trunk.
The
So
trailer.
the doer, yeah, the trailer now. The doer is getting off slowly. The action is done that remains. And that's where it becomes interesting because the deeper patterns of jamming start to come up, various unconscious tendencies, uh, internalized words of dejection or denigration or prohibition or devaluation, which any of us received in one way or another. Like you said, when you post recovery from injury, you receive lots of negativity, whether you want it or not, or when you're trying to do something, you, as people don't know or have an idea or appreciation of, you receive lots of negativity, and that becomes internalized, gets jammed in there in the system as devaluation of who you are or what you do. And yeah, especially when we are younger and we depend on other people for this language that you receive because it defines us. We absorb this kind of stuff, these signifiers, as we call them in psychoanalytic jargon, and they stay inside. So when somebody regresses more into that trance state, all this kind of stuff starts to unravel. Yeah. And you encounter further kinds of jamming. And usually it's released in one way or another. When we talk about gross and bridal trance states, traditional trance, that's where screaming and wailing and rolling and growling and thrashing around comes into the picture. So the body undoes the effects of, depreciation, inhibition, malicious judgment, or whatever, or downright violence, even traumatic incidents are like that. They leave an imprint. So that starts to unravel. In one way or another, it goes. And the danger then is to get attached to it, to the process of release, because it's pleasant, because you unbind. You're no longer inhibited by all these negative programming. It goes. So you want more of it because it's pleasant. Uh, so that's how people get stuck into spontaneous releases, spontaneous energetic movement, induced trance states, um, and whatever else that gives them access to it. including taking substances and whatever. But that's also one stage, and it can go even deeper, because that stuff needs to be passed. It's all temporary. Once those, adhesions and blockages in the psychosomatic landscape of yours dissolve or unbind, there goes something else, something deeper. Well, trance only shows that there is nobody home. Self is not quite there. Gives you a glimpse, really, of what it is like.
Just to come back to this idea of unbinding. So I suppose, with trance, I don't have much experience of trance. From what I noticed in myself is that you do have to go through a process of approaching this unbinding because you are not, or just even recognizing that we are capable of doing that. There is a way of accessing this unbinding activity through movement, through performance, through this gathering. I mean, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect this really with now this sense of release and the concept of release and the various ways of releasing in the internal arts. And we started by talking about flow and shifting the conscious mind into the background and allowing something else to drive, to, is there a better word? I don't know. And then we move to this idea of, less, we have these patterns that already we exist in our body through the activities that we've been practicing. And then if we engage in some kind of trance activity, the body or the mind, I should say, if I understand correctly, is led into this situation where you are given permission to drop all of this socialized conforming, the socialized conforming patterns that we've developed, either through training or through any socialized activity. So I'm curious about when you first came in contact with the internal arts and you had already these experiences of flow, of trance, of releasing, of becoming unbound. What was your early experience of practicing the internal training?
Well, I went through stages of engagement with the internal arts, and one of the earliest ones was before I went through the, unbinding stages of trance practice and things like that. And internal arts were quite frustrating thing to do for me. It was like, oh, bloody hell, you got to stand still and keep the mind inside. That's a torture. It's a torture when you have, a lot of blockages in the body, and a lot of them are, psycho-emotional in character. So they need to go. Okay, so I didn't do internal arts for a while and then engaged in other practices, trance forever, physical training. But then when I came back to internal arts again, oh, okay, that was easier. That was doable actually. And what else I discovered that I have very little of what they call spontaneous energetic movement within internal arts, which is when the body starts purging, throwing out all these blockages, which also includes kind of similar phenomena as you encounter in trance. People scream and wail and shiver and twist and contort and move in spontaneous, spasmodic, or twisted fashion, collapse onto the floor, prostrate, roll around, dance, do spontaneous improvised movements of martial arts, produce various shapes with their fingers, which resemble mudras or whatever, etc. So the body kind of, does all that. It unwinds and purges. People make sounds, people cough and sneeze and scream and whatever else. Pathogens leave their bodies. So I discovered that I had very little of that because I already went through the process by other means. But internal arts is certainly a big subject. We can probably give it a whole different conversation sometime.
Yes.
But yeah,
Yeah, I
thanks
think
for
we can
this
do.
question. How did you find trance practice when you engaged with it not so long ago? And how is it in comparison to flow states? Because you have experience of both in martial arts. You experience flow states. And how did you find trance in comparison?
Well, I think in terms of flow states, I think both of us would have experienced flow in different contexts, not just when we do physical activity. We experience flow in writing, in conversation, in simply walking. You can, it is a somatic state where it's like mind and body, but it doesn't have to be like this intense activity. It's just that when I was competing, there are definitely some moments that just stand out because of the intensity of the moment and the brevity, yet how expansive I felt and how this one moment was able to unlock insight into my relationship with things that are happening around me, the world, and how I was impacting it through my own movement, through my choices. So that for me stands out. And in competition, that's happened. But it doesn't mean that I haven't experienced flow in other more everyday situations. In terms of trance, what I found interesting was I was definitely initiated in in a matter of speaking to the East Javanese bull trance ritual, but there was no instructions that were given to me. So for me, mentally, I was already coming into this practice with a wish to kind of shift or shed part of this competition body, not so much the martial arts body, which is something that I've realized in the last few months. It's not that I wish to completely dissolve the body of martial arts, which is what I originally thought I wanted to do. But what I realized is that no, it's not that actually. It's the mindset of competition and the mindset of like the fixed mindset, which is something that I have been working with over many years in terms of how to, through developing various qualities through training, like patience, or I was going to say forbearance, but that's also patience, I suppose. So it's like the main theme for me is patience. Yeah. So I've really been working with this theme of patience throughout my competition journey and through my experience of competitive martial arts and also how I enact the training, when it's free. You mentioned that first we learn the patterns, then we learn the katas, then we learn the so it's Kihon, then we learn the katas, and then we learn kumite, but then we have kumite drills, and then it's free, it's open, where you're allowed to express yourself that way. And I have struggled with feeling like I expressed myself the way that I wanted to. So being able to do that, I think necessarily in competition where you're expected to perform, that is the body that I wanted to sort of emancipate. So I wanted to shed that body. And so when I entered into this trance ritual,
I'm very sorry. Could you reiterate again? Which body did you want to shed?
the body that wants to win, the body that
Oh,
wishes to do things to perfection, this body. But it's interesting because actually, like I still use that body quite a bit, but but I'm less like grasping onto, feeling like a perfectionist or trying to strive for a particular, the striving part actually is the part that I wanted to get rid of. I mean, there was aspects of my training and the way that I thought movement should be. So these types of thoughts these are the types of things that I wanted, that I was experimenting with, and that I was experimenting with as I was entering into the trance ritual. And so over this, like a short period of time, when I was exposed to trance, I felt I wanted to allow myself to, for the conscious mind at the front, to give it space in order to get out of the front seat and just walk into the trailer, basically, as we've said. And and so this process happened over a week. And that's when the process started. I think I felt at the start, when I was first introduced to different movements or different ways of practicing movement and exploring different movements away from martial arts, that I became interested in seeing what else would come out of my body if I would allow the unconscious mind to be in control. And so for me, in the trance, although because we had this sort of community that was around us as well, we felt quite safe to let go in a way, and to allow this undoing of the prescription and the training, and see what emerges from that. And often in that state, it is surprising to see what comes out, but then not having this judgmental external eye, at least for me. I know there's an audience who's watching, but I think as a beginner or as a new initiate to this type of practice, I wasn't so concerned with the audience. So when you said that, when you talked about, what did you say? How did you phrase it? Something that just comes out of the body with no particular structure.
Is that how you felt?
A little bit, yeah. For me, it's difficult still to articulate. Like there was still intention, and there was still definitely movements that I was enjoying, but there was less preconceived connectivity between the movements. And there's not anymore this idea of scoring or winning or perfecting, and things can be unfinished. And so allowing myself to rest in this, to abide in this trance movement, where my mind was allowed to purge some of this fixedness, was very freeing at the time.
Yeah, yeah. I think that brings me kind of to a more strict definition of what is flow and what is trance. I think flow is something that relies on, preconceived, pre-learned techniques very much. So then in those states of flow, you can just flow between that which you already know, and perhaps discover new combination of how to connect known patterns together. That's
But
probably why
maybe,
flow state is more applicable to a certain craft or the activity that is determined. What did you want to say?
well, sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking that maybe flow is also connected with some kind of goal. Um, what do
Yeah,
you
yeah.
think? Whereas trance, what is the goal?
Well, there is a process of certain intentionality taking place before the trance ritual, and so that's what unravels during the ritual. If it's a performance type event like what we did, then the goal is connection, unity with the audience, and certain expression. This is a mediumistic aspect of trance, whereby the practitioner who falls into trance becomes a vehicle to express the affectivity of the audience. But that's a different topic to talk about altogether. I think within the trance, the goal is less pronounced. That's what makes it more difficult. And that's why people who have more sort of strict, strong, rigid conscious control of their minds over them struggle this trance. They can't really give up, give in. Often I observe when people have certain, pre-learned pattern of movement that they have, a certain technique of dance or a martial art, they tend to revert back to it when they are in trance. Yeah. So it takes a certain, like you had an intentionality for yourself, how to actually undo it, not revert to that habitual pattern. And I think you did quite good in that time. So that what becomes difficult and interesting and tricky, how you can find a completely new area. And that's what is a great motivator for people who are involved with trance practice, like my friend Tony Yap or my friend Kian. That's the area they're tripping on, kind of thing. How to enter that, the novelty, the real, I would call it, the unbridled, the extraordinary, something not experienced before. Because in our lives and habitual practice that we do, we are so constantly, certainly fixed with habitual patterns. And the trance provides that liberating effect of encountering something entirely other. That's why it can also be scary. But again, we can talk about it more some other time.
Mhm. Actually, as we wrap up, I was just thinking that perhaps because all of this training is actually becoming part of the real body, then, there's no reason to necessarily shed or undo all of it. It's more about, I suppose, is it about just working with it and being aware of and noticing when the different aspects of who we are emerge, and to have the agency to shift from towards or away from these tendencies.
Well, yeah, there are completely habitual tendencies, but there is also depth and novelty within the habitual tendencies. Like, there is breadth and there is depth, isn't it? You can go into the same old punch or whatever and discover
Mm.
great depth in there. But for that, you need to also kind of dissociate from the habitual level of that
It's
same
this
old
this kind
technique.
of mystical dissociation.
Well, yeah, that's what internal arts are based a lot on, of the ability of the mind to step back from its rigidity, from its intensity, from its fixity, to actually soften so it can find something inside where it can rest, or which it can rest with. So the internal start to appear. It's a major difference, if you start to categorize between external and internal arts, the internal has to appear. So that internal arts could be performed. So that mind needs to be stepped back. And I think the quality that trance provides is quite useful for it, but it's not the same thing,
Mhm.
because mind needs to be in the body very much stabilized for the internal arts practice. Whereas in trance, it can dissociate all you have and take the body on the ride. I will visit.
Mm. Well, thank you very much for today's chat.
Thank you very much too.
Always a pleasure.
Indeed. And thanks everyone who's been watching this or listening.
See you next time.